Now.
Hello, everyone. It is my honor to introduce Diane Lillo-Martin. She is a well-renowned professor. Hello, everyone. It is my honor to introduce Diane is also the president of SLLS. She's a well-renowned professor. The topic is related to language acquisition and linguistic theory. Diane is also the president of SLLS. I'm so grateful that Diane was welcome to become part of this presentation, and we're really looking forward to having her. After the presentation, we will be having a 30-minute question and answer opportunity for anyone that would like. So thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ronisi, for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to try to take some turns with both sharing my screen, showing the slides, and then going back to only showing me doing the presentation. So you'll be seeing that throughout the rest of this presentation today. There are some differences between spoken languages and sign languages, of course. With linguistic analysis in spoken language being so prevalent, we think it's so important to get more information about sign language. Often people think that spoken language is something that is worthwhile to look into, and that sign language is kind of its own unique thing with its own unique properties. And so those wouldn't at all possibly apply to spoken language. But that's the thing. Yes, of course, there are differences between some spoken language properties as well as sign language properties. But we're trying to think about not only the form, but what is consistent. What's universal across all languages? What properties are shared? And for that reason, it's important that sign language be attended to as well. For language acquisition, it's important that we do assessment of that language acquisition process in sign language. There are some things that are unique to sign language, but it doesn't have to be something that doesn't allow us to make any kind of parallels or pattern recognition with spoken language, because linguistic theory is a foundation between the both of them. I'd like to talk about different aspects of sign language acquisition and what commonalities are similar to spoken language acquisition. The analysis of sign language acquisition, how that can inform us further about the language structure. The modality of sign language is different. And that is one of our research questions. Does modality affect language acquisition? And if so, what impacts does it have? And what happens if an individual is bilingual, if they have access to both sign language and spoken language? How might that be different than someone who's bilingual in 2 spoken languages? Often deaf children are born and have no access to a natural language, a visual language. And because of that, there's delayed language acquisition. With sign language acquisition, if the input is subpar, maybe their sign language isn't as good, it really depends upon the context and the signing models that these children are growing up with, and that will affect their ultimate language acquisition. We also want to look into if a child is born deaf and they are born to parents who don't share that deafness with them, they're hearing, and they want to try to learn sign language to be able to communicate with their deaf child. How are parents learning alongside their child? With those research questions, I'd like to share some of the results that we've come up with. In a situation where a child is exposed to language from birth with a good sign model, what kind of information can we gather? We have one example from previous research. And that research talks about the structure and the relationship between natural language exposure and grammatical acquisition. We were looking at American Sign Language and Libris. There are 3 different structures that we talked about that sign language applies to. The first being focusing on new information. If there's a question posed and then they respond, it's possible that it's often that new information is put at the beginning of the sentence. Typically, the word order is subject, verb, object, and the first part of the answer might not actually be a subject. It's possible to have other parts of speech take that position, that initial position, because the information that's to be focused on is the new information. It's also possible to give an answer to the same question with the typical subject, verb, object, word order. Either are acceptable. The second topic that we talked about is when a sign can be doubled. That means that the sign can show up in its traditional position, and then it can be added again at the end of the sentence. And as such, it would be doubled because it's both in the original position and in the final position. Some researchers have said that that doubling is a different focus than informational. It's done for emphasis. It's also possible to see a sign show up in the middle of the sentence and in the final position, or to only be in the final position. That final position was something that we wanted to analyze and look into more deeply to understand how it affects emphasis. So either both show up or it's only in the final position. And that would mean that it has to be related in some way. But being able to identify the differences between those two will help us to be able to understand further and help us to be able to make predictions. Those were different examples of each of the different structures. The first being having a question answered and the new information being put at the beginning of the sentence. The second one is doubling, and then that's something that you like can read can, for example. And then the last is in the final position. The structural analysis for these are very similar, and it helps us to be able to predict language acquisition because they're being acquired at the same time. If doubling has been acquired, then it's also going to be the case that final position has also been acquired. If they weren't related, we wouldn't expect to be able to see it both in the middle and final and only in the final. And you wouldn't expect them to be acquired at the same time if they were actually different. To analyze this, we followed children who had deaf parents that were able to have natural language acquisition. At home, they feel comfortable, they're able to understand everything that's going on in the environment, they're able to play. We collected data over months and over years' times to be able to document exactly that progression. And specifically, we're looking for that structure of interest. And this process was done manually. We're interested in seeing when they start using this. If they start to develop that fluency and then don't end up using it again, then that's not something that we're following. But after the first time of being able to capture that in our data collection, if they continue to do that, then we can believe that there's repeated use. And that information is something that we're interested in looking into deeper. And we're interested in seeing if there's any statistical difference between the two, and we use statistical analysis to be able to determine that. We did data analysis on 4 children. 2 were from America, learning American Sign Language. 2 from Brazil, learning Libras. They're of similar ages. They were of a younger age. We started filming around 1.5. And then we continued until about age 3 to see what kind of structures they acquire. For all 4 children, analysis on all 3 structures was done. And we looked particularly at the first onset, the youngest that we were able to capture in data collection. And that means that actually we were filming at a very young age because the time for acquisition of that is particularly young. For the doubling and for final position, there was a significant difference. So if we're talking about the first, which was the focus on information, there was a significant difference between the other 2 for all 4 children. The age for acquisition for doubling and final position structures was not statistically significant. At roughly around the same age, both are acquired. And that would support the idea that these 2 are actually related.
So it appears that the doubling structure and the final position structure must be related. And we have enough data to support our conclusions around that. Now for the second part. Now we come to the question of modality and how that affects acquisition. We'll be looking at the question of pointing and how it functions differently in sign languages. Sign languages around the world use pointing as a function. This is commonly used. And the question is, how is it acquired? How is the system for pronominalization acquired by speakers of sign languages and differentiated from that of pointing? Pointing can be used as the pronoun for the self, pointing at oneself, or for pointing at the addressee, who would in a spoken language, in English, for example, would be called you. A third party could be pointed to and be referred to in using this pronoun structure. But pointing can also be used for pointing at objects or pointing towards locations. And this is another common usage. So how do we make the distinction between these two types of pointing? And this is a topic of quite a bit of research and discussion at the moment. Researchers have a variety of perspectives on this matter. Pointing is used by hearing people who use spoken languages. And in those situations, pointing is used as a gesture. But in sign languages, we see pointing used also in the pronominal system. There are even amongst researchers who accept that pointing is used as a pronominal system in sign languages. There are debates around the difference between how many pronouns are articulated distinctly. Is there a distinct first, second, and third person pronoun, for example? Some say there are, some say there is only a first and a non-first. Some researchers will say there is no distinction between the second and third person in these pronominal systems. And it's just a question of where other parties are situated in a particular conversation that they might be referred to. There have been other proposals around that applies cross-linguistically, that pronominal systems should be represented morphologically along with their features in a structure such as what was depicted previously, and that distinction can be made between marked and unmarked pronouns. And we see from many languages, spoken or signed, that pronouns can be categorized this way. And doing so allows us to make predictions. We can make predictions about acquisitional order. We can predict that unmarked features will be acquired earlier and that marked features will be acquired later. So does this model help us in our analysis of the pronominal system of sign languages? So we have several research questions. Is pointing, gestural pointing, distinct from pronominal pointing? Are they acquired differently? Are the pronominal categories distinct and are they acquired differently? And does the Harley and Ritter model apply to the pronominal pointing we see in sign languages? There have been many people, many researchers who have looked at pointing for hearing people using spoken languages. Young children, earlier than the age of 1, often are seen to use pointing, whether they are hearing or deaf. And pointing seems to be something that is easy for children to acquire. Does that mean that in a sign language system, pronouns would be acquired more easily because they are based on pointing? One thing that is not seen in hearing research on hearing children is pointing at people. It doesn't seem to occur. Pointing seems to happen in relation to objects, but in sign language systems, we see pointing at people. So where does this come from? If hearing children are pointing gesturally, but not at people, and that is not, there is no substantiation of that in the literature that it is happening, what are we seeing and how do we analyze it in sign languages? We have looked at video data for 4 children who are learning English and who are not exposed to sign language. We've looked at the ways that they're using gestural pointing between the ages of 2 and 3. And specifically, we had the question of, do they point at people? And we see this occurring only a few times, and only in the context of playing a game where a mother says, "Where's mommy?" and the child points at their mother. In that context, children are pointing at people, but we don't see pointing at people in any other context. We see no pointing to themselves, to refer to themselves. And it seems that, at least in our data, children between the ages of 2 and 3 are not using pointing to point to people. if hearing children are not pointing to people, they still use a pronominal system. They're using the spoken language and using pronouns. So the function of pointing and the function of pronouns seems to be separate. With deaf children who are acquiring a sign language, when do they develop the pointing as a pronoun? We looked at 4 children in naturalistic situations. We filmed them. We analyzed the videos. And these children are all deaf and they have deaf parents. We started filming at roughly a year and a half and continued filming up through their 3rd year, up until their 3rd year. And we looked at pointing. When does pointing occur? What does it mean? When do they start pointing to themselves? When do they start pointing to other addressees in the conversation? And we analyze our data using first repeated use. We analyzed the data from 4 children. And our analysis looked at varieties of pointing. In our results, you will see first inanimate, then in the chart, you'll see in the first column, not inanimate, then first person, second person, and third person. When we noted first repeated use. Acquisition age is indicated by the circle or the oval. So anything that is circled in the same circle or oval was acquired at the same time. Separate circles and ovals indicate a different age of acquisition. Dark blue indicates a very early age of acquisition, and the lighter blue indicates a later age of acquisition. So if you're ready, I will show you this visualization. Regardless of age of acquisition, the order seems to be consistent. All 4 children acquired these pronouns in the order depicted. Although they varied in the speed at which they were acquiring these pronouns. And we see pointing arising early with hearing children. We see the same with deaf children. We see children referring to themselves using the pointing pronoun at an early age, as well as, and then subsequently pointing to others. So after starting to refer to the self, they subsequently start referring to other addressees. So you, or the second person you, or the third person he or she. The third person occurs less frequently in our data. But when it did, when we did see it in our data, it occurred after acquisition of the second person. So we see quite a difference between hearing children acquiring a spoken language and deaf children acquiring a sign language. The pronominal system in sign languages seem to have an acquisitional order. And this acquisitional order fits what we would expect to see given Harley and Ritter's model. So I'm moving through these things a little bit quickly tonight. And I will summarize. We see a difference in pointing between hearing and deaf children acquiring a sign language. We see pronouns acquired in categories and following an acquisitional order. Now we move on to our next topic. If children are acquiring a sign language and a spoken language from a young age, what do we see? We know that bilinguals generally we see certain structures and certain interaction between languages. The two languages are always on, so to speak, in the brain. And we know this from research in spoken language. But what happens when one of the languages being acquired at a young age is a sign language? And how do the sign language and the spoken language that are being acquired interact within the system? What relationship do we see? So we will talk about two kinds of interaction. I will give a brief introduction to one of these examples and demonstrate how the sign language and the spoken language being acquired interact with one another. In particular, we will talk about how bilinguals in this situation use the WH question. So we look at children who are called CODAs, K-O-D-A, children who can hear but whose parents are deaf and who are acquiring a sign language from their family and a spoken language from society at large. We're also looking at children who are born to deaf parents and these children sign, as do their parents. And these children who are deaf have a cochlear implant, so they are able to access the spoken language of dominant society. Part of our research project is looking at bilingual bimodals. We look at children in the United States who are learning ASL and English, and children in Brazil who are learning Brazilian Portuguese as well as Libras. And our example of the WH question shows the way that children who are acquiring these languages bilingually have these languages interacting. I will have a second example as well. I will go through that very briefly. And that example will be around how the languages can be used simultaneously in some situations. If two languages that are being acquired can interact with one another, some examples of interaction are what we will call synthesis. And in regard to the WH question, we see structures borrowed from one language and used in the other, either from the spoken language into the sign language or from the sign language into the spoken language. And we see both languages influencing each other. So I will talk about what we have discovered from one of our experiments with these bilingual children, but we have evidence of interactions from a variety of different contexts. In our research, we looked at these bilingual children and we tested their sign language and their spoken language in production. We also wanted to see how they used varying structures in their sign languages. In both ASL and Libras, WH questions can appear in several positions. They can appear at the beginning of the sentence, they can be doubled, and they can appear in final position. This is similar to the beginning of my talk where I talked about these structures or these positions in the sentence. Previously, we looked at children who were deaf, who were acquiring sign language natively. And we discovered that they used WH questions in different positions differently. In the chart I just showed, we show the way that deaf children acquiring sign language are using these positions for different purposes. Next, we will be looking at our data from children from the age of 4 to 7 who are bilingual, acquiring ASL in English, and who are from Brazil, acquiring Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, and Libras. Look to see in this depiction whether the colors are the same or different. American children tend to use the first position for their WH questions. And that seems to be influenced heavily from their knowledge of English. Deaf children do not use a single structure, a single position in their signed sentences, but these bilingual children do. So we suspect an influence from English. In Brazilian bilinguals, we see a little bit of difference. We see a variation in position used in the sign language. But children at the age of 7, we notice, suddenly start relying heavily on the first position. And 7 is the age when children start to enter school. And we suspect that schooling is having this impact on their language choice. And schooling, of course, is conducted in Brazilian Portuguese. Given the time, I'm moving ahead and skipping a part that I would have talked about otherwise, and I'll move right along in towards the end. I'd like to talk about late exposure. A variety of researchers have found that later exposure of a sign language for deaf children has a variety of results. Only 5% of deaf children are born into signing deaf families, and the other 95% are often later exposed to a sign language. We do see some impacts of that later language exposure. And we can find specific linguistic impact in these situations. I won't go into detail about this because time is running out, but I will show you briefly what we would expect this to look like. So I will explain briefly part of one study that we did. We looked at 2 children who were not provided early intervention services and were not exposed to sign language at an early age. Their hearing parents weren't sure quite what to do with their deaf children until about the age of 6, at which time these children were put into a school for the deaf and started acquiring a sign language. We collected data on these children in naturalistic settings over a period of time. And we analyzed our data for looking at their use of verbs and verb agreement. What is verb agreement for person, and then verb agreement for location, and how was it used? We were looking for what kinds of errors we might see in their language production. And in the previous slide, you saw four charts. The top two showed the rate of errors for these two children. One, as compared to early exposed children around the age of 3, and their errors were minimal. We don't see many errors in children who are natively exposed. In the bottom two charts, we saw the two late exposed children, and we see quite a few errors indicated. Interestingly, their errors were primarily with person agreement. We didn't see many errors with location agreement. And what does this tell us? It would seem that person agreement is extremely affected by late language acquisition. Many researchers are looking at the effects of later language exposure, and we're learning a lot about language that way. But unfortunately, the studies are on people who are children who are in traumatic experiences and who should never have to live through these experiences. So are there ways that we can study this in a different way?
If there's exposure from birth to both languages, then we can see these results. If there's delayed acquisition of language, then that's going to be that will impact their ability to progress. The other thing that we've known is that most deaf children are born to parents who are not deaf, that don't sign. And if parents do decide that they want to learn sign language for their children, what is the result of that? Hearing parents that decide to learn sign language, the question is, can they learn fast enough? Are they going to be able to communicate well enough with their deaf babies to be able to provide the information that's necessary and the language model? And we don't know. And so the question is, if hearing parents do try to learn sign language, what happens? We now have a group that is interested in collecting that information. If parents are trying to learn sign language for their deaf children, in what manners are they doing so? What does the progress look like? We want to be able to assess their sign language skills and see how that affects the children. What are the children's sign language development look like? If they have access to spoken language, how does that development work? We're interested in seeing how parents learning sign language can have an influence on their children, but we're only at the very beginning, so we don't have an answer to this research question just yet, but we hope to be able to give you more information later, so stay tuned. In summary, it seems like sign language acquisition data can help us to understand linguistic theory and inform our understanding. And we're interested in seeing how spoken language and sign language can have an effect on each other. Spoken languages and sign languages are not necessarily different. In all ways, there are some similarities, and the uniqueness is something that we want to look into and see how we can apply that to spoken language. And we hope that in the future, we'll be able to avoid the situation of children having such late acquisition and exposure to proper sign models. And we're hoping to do so by supporting families. Thank you so much for your attention this evening. I've been so excited to be able to share our research with you. And I hope that I've sparked interest in you and you want to learn some more. If you have any questions, we now have some time for Q&A, and we'll be accepting those at this time.
Well, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. You shared so many things with us. And we here in Brazil are happy to see how your studies of language and linguistics given acquisition are going. So thank you. I have selected a few questions. There were quite a few questions to choose from. And we'll see how many you have a chance to respond to. So the first question is related to UG, Universal Grammar. Do you think UG operates in the same with sign languages and spoken languages? And can you talk about that?
Thank you for that question. I think doing an analysis of sign language acquisition using the idea of UG is a really fascinating concept. I've showed two short examples from research, and sometimes the grammatical properties of the language and the analysis seem to be very similar in terms of principle for universal grammar between both sign languages and spoken languages. When I think of universal grammar, it makes me think of having the same principles that apply to all languages. Of course, there'll be some variability. There'll be different ways in which those principles apply in each language, but it should be incorporated in each kind of language that exists. And it's interesting to look into what some of the common principles are within the variation. UG suggests a limited variation and how sign language fits into it. But it's very important to know that sign language has some properties that are based on the modality, the use of space, showing things in space can show 3 dimensions. You can show multiple individuals in a conversation. It's more iconic and can provide more representation. There's been a lot of research that has shown that we need more research to show that is unique. There are some iconicities that can be found in different languages, and there are some in spoken languages and the patterns and the references, but it seems that sign languages are more rich in this aspect. UG talks about how there are commonalities, but sign languages do have their own unique aspects. There are some things that are different from sign languages compared to spoken languages. And in that way, sign language acquisition in some ways is different than spoken languages based on the modality itself. And in that sense, that universal grammar might not actually apply to all languages in all ways. It'll apply to it'll apply to core things, but maybe not all features. But yes, I do believe that universal grammar does apply to both spoken and sign languages.
Thank you so much. And now our second question. So David M. Strong's book, Originals, he says, Originals, his book is called Original Signs. he says that gestures can be more linguistic if they are paired with spoken word. If pointing occurs with sign, could that be gestural, as David says, in that he says gesture with spoken word is more powerful? And do you agree or not, and why?
That's a great question. Thank you. One of the benefits of sign language research for linguistics as a whole is that most linguistic research is very limited and it needs to be broadened. And thinking about how pointing and gesturing is related with language. I wouldn't say that it's all within one system. I do still feel like there is some separation. And we're talking about language boundaries between both sign language and spoken language. It needs to include both. If we're talking about gestural language for spoken languages like pointing, that would be an example. As I mentioned, pointing in sign language can be used as a pronoun or as a gesture. In spoken language, there would be different words that would be related to it. So in English, it might be he, it, there, for example. And I think that in typical language use, that pointing would be incorporated. And you would use the pointing, and then in English, you would say that, for example. So that spoken language of that and pointing, or pointing to something and saying over there, pairs both spoken language and sign language. It pairs the word and the sign together. But in sign language, it includes both. It's not only for pointing purposes, it also can refer to pronouns. Spoken language research can do well if they do more research on gesture. Of course, there are many people that are currently doing this research, but I think that we would really benefit from having more understanding of how gestures and spoken language can be related. If you're interested, you can look into spoken language research talking about gestures and how those two can be paired together. The next question is for hearing children. They typically start saying their name before they use first person pronouns. Have you found any research that shows that deaf children have similar patterns?
Yes, in our project, we have looked at that. In the 4 children that we have studied, we're studying their acquisition of pointing. none of them have been using their own name before the first person pronoun. Their name seems to occur around 3 years and 6 months, but not before the use of the first person pronoun. For English-speaking children, sentences require a subject. And children do often drop the subject. We see that happening. But in time, children start using the subject as the language requires. And children will use their name instead of the subject on occasion. So sometimes, alternatively, they will say baby. Children might say, not you, but they will say mama, or to their mother or to their parents. Parents will also do it as well, where the mother will say, no, mama's doing that now. But they won't use their name. They won't say, for example, Diane is doing that now. So in English-speaking children, we do see the use of their name or another word at that early age. And with ASL acquiring children, ASL does not require a subject often. It's a language that drops the subject. So I think more often what we see is a dropped subject altogether. And they don't replace the first person pronoun with their own name or with another word. Children might use the sign for mother in replacement of the pronoun you, or the second person pronoun, for example. We haven't analyzed their productions in those terms yet. So we would have to do more analysis to see whether that seems to be true. We've looked to see for self, the first person pronoun self, the child's name, and replacement words, and we don't see that happening with our ASL acquiring children.
The next question is, how would you explain the acquisition of pointing with verb agreement?
And if you could actually just ask that question again, I missed part of it.
What are the implications for pronominal signs and pointing? And verb agreement. Related to linguistic theory. And what are the linguistic interactions? And what is the research related to linguistic interactions?
So I had wanted to include some research in pointing as well as verb agreement, because both require the use of space in sign languages. And space is a unique feature in sign languages. And when I say unique, I do not mean to say that it is some polar opposite from what happens in spoken languages. There are certainly some, there's some caveat should be taken that the use of space is a somewhat unique property. And in the use of space also agreement occurs. So where exactly a verb is moving from and to is indicated in space, to move from here to there or from there to here. And that aligns with real-world mental representation. In the linguistic system, linguistic representation can be shown using syntactic trees, showing how verb agreement occurs, how certain features have to match across different terms. And that occurs in a theoretical way. We can analyze morphological agreement with formal and abstract theoretical systems, surely. But there are some differences, and that occurs where we see space used, where we see linguistic structures set up in particular ways in three-dimensional space, where one person is represented on the left side of the body, another person is represented on the right side of the body, and the sentence is formulated in alignment with these structures being set up in this way. And in some ways, I think we need to have a more powerful linguistic theory to account for this. And I think we can use the mechanisms that we already have in some ways. Linguistic pointing, pronominal pointing, might use the same mechanisms for pronouns and for verb agreement. On some basic level, the mechanism is the same, but there might be other aspects that need to be accounted for in a different way with more advanced features. And our formal theory of all of this needs to be more powerful to account for what we see in sign languages. And of course, interaction is critical for language acquisition. Children must interact. They must be exposed to something to acquire it. Social interaction is first and foremost in any kind of linguistic acquisition. And from a formal UG perspective, we can't ignore interaction. I do think what's critical is that children have linguistic input from peers and other speakers of the language in order to develop. And I will admit, I have changed my perspective on this over time. I think it is so critical for language development to have interaction, both for language and for other cognitive systems. Interaction with other humans is key. It's a key part of language acquisition. And I see children requiring linguistic interaction, but I also see them using their inner faculties, their own innate abilities, their own internal mechanisms and formal internal systems. And this is a part of research that, an aspect of research that I haven't done. But what happens to children when they have no linguistic input? They create their own systems. They create their own home sign systems, for example. And these systems are not as robust as established languages are, but they have coherence and consistency within them. So interpersonal interaction is critical, but there's also something going on internally, innately, with the child's brain. There are mechanisms that are ready for language. They know how to create and manage rules and how to manage expectations, linguistic expectations. And they know already how languages need to be formalized in the brain. So we have to look at both of these things.
Thank you. I have two more questions for you. Do you believe that language processing systems can be improved or helped by doubling?
So this is a good question, and I haven't thought too much about it. Let me start by talking about final position. Many researchers see final position used for emphasis. And this is prosodic emphasis, a way of drawing attention to a certain piece of content in a sentence, which comes finally. Sign languages use the beginning, the initial position for known information, subsequently followed by new information. And this seems to be commonly true for sign languages as well as spoken languages. But we see differences in how emphasis is managed, whether it's on verb, whether it's on the production of the verb, whether it's the position in the sentence. And sign languages tend to do this prosodic emphasis in the final position. And there might be a need to explain why we're seeing this. Why do sign languages prefer this position for that purpose? And this could be in regard to cognitive processing. I also suspect the final position has more saliency. It is a position that is presented and held for longer. So the question of whether this position is good for processing is there as well. And we could ask the same question with doubling. So whatever word or sign could occur in its typical position as well as in the final position. And what this might mean for processing is it's known that the terminal position is used for emphatic processing. So maybe there is something that occurs where if in the ordinary position, a piece of information could be missed, in having it placed redundantly at the final position could be helpful to processing. And I don't know, I'm spitballing here. It is certainly a testable hypothesis. One could run an experiment to look at the effects of doubling and what effort is required in sentences that are doubled versus sentences that aren't. And one could see whether the final position versus doubling has any effect on that effort in cognitive processing. Thank you.
The final question. is more general. Do you think that deaf children should have early access to language, or do you think that it should be to sign language, or do you think that it should be something that happens as it happens?
I think it is critical that deaf children be exposed to sign language. For children who are born into situations where they do not have access to spoken languages because of their auditory access or lack thereof, and it is identified that the child is in that situation. Often today we're seeing children given cochlear implants and assistive technologies, and in some ways that might help with hearing. But cochlear implants and speech processing is not equivalent to natural language. Cochlear implants and assistive technology provide access to sound, but it's not natural sound. It's not natural language. A child who has a cochlear implant must learn how to listen at the same time that they're trying to acquire language. If a child is born with typical hearing, they begin acquisition immediately, organically. They need no instruction, but children with cochlear implants need regular ongoing instruction and practice in acquiring a spoken language. A cochlear implant will not immediately resolve the issue of not hearing the spoken language. And it could take time before that child who is to receive a cochlear implant actually receives it. And all of that time is lost in waiting for the assistive technology to happen. And for some children, the acquisition of spoken language might be possible, and that is fine. That is wonderful. There are many children who cannot hear, who will always struggle with learning a spoken language. And if children are exposed first to a sign language, at the earliest age possible, as soon as that happens, the child starts to build linguistic structures in the brain. And then the child can learn other languages as well, if they have the opportunity to do so. There's no reason that a child couldn't learn multiple languages. But the earlier that this child is identified and exposed to sign language, they can start to develop their linguistic foundation. And in our bilingual bimodal research, what we're seeing is that deaf children who have deaf parents, and then those children who are subsequently given a cochlear implant as assistive technology, they acquire sign language and spoken language, and they acquire them both well. They acquire them parallel to many coda children who are themselves hearing and acquiring a spoken language, but who have deaf parents and are learning sign language at the home. So learning sign language from an early age does not hurt, and it probably helps even in the acquisition of a spoken language. So yes, I think deaf children should be exposed to a sign language as early as possible. And I would like to add one more point. No, that's okay. No, that's okay. Go ahead, Renisi. Thank you.
There are so many comments saying thank you for your wonderful presentation, and I want to make sure I share that with you.
Oh, thank you. I will make sure that I take a look at the comments later myself.
That sounds great. We're going to be closing this talk, and I just want to say that everyone has really enjoyed your talk, and we look forward to hearing you again. We want to thank all of the interpreters going from ASL to English, going into Brazilian Portuguese, going into Libras. Quite a complex setup of interpreters. So thank you, all of you.
Yes, and thank you all for watching. It's been my pleasure. I look forward to reading your comments. And thank you to all of the